Welcome to Race Class Academy. The goal is to explain ideas and insights that can help you work with others to build a multiracial progressive majority. Level 1, dog whistle politics. It's the main political weapon we face, and you can trace it to this man. In 1963, Barry Goldwater and his faction within the Republican Party wanted to return the country to a time when the government mainly worked for the wealthy. The previous time, corporate greed had tanked the economy and triggered the Great Depression. After that, we embraced the New Deal. We as a country understood that government must play an essential role in regulating corporations, creating ladders of upward mobility, and ensuring that economic winners pay their fair share. That's how we grew the largest middle class the world had ever seen. Goldwater campaigned against the New Deal, but he knew his economic agenda was unpopular, so he came up with an outrageous strategy. Here's what conservative journalist Robert Novak reported. Perhaps a majority of the party's leadership envisioned substantial political gold to be mined in the racial crisis by becoming, in fact, though not in name, the white man's party. The racial crisis? That was the civil rights movement. In fact, but not in name? Here's where Goldwater innovated. He would promote white supremacy, but do so using code. For instance, Goldwater would shout about law and order, as if he was talking about crime in general, rather than spreading the lie that black civil rights protesters were violent hoodlums. This is dog whistle politics. It allows politicians to promote social hatreds, especially but not only racism, while pretending they honor equality. Goldwater would lose, but dog whistle politics won. 1964 would be the last year a Democratic candidate for president would win a majority of the white vote. Next up, racism as a weapon of the rich.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for being with us today. I'm Rowena Naidu, Vice President for Policy and Community Initiatives at Mile High United Way, and I'm honored to be your host today. Thanks for joining us for another important, difficult, uncomfortable, but necessary conversation in our social justice series. The clip we just viewed is a snippet of what we're going to learn from our esteemed guest today, Professor Ian Haney Lopez. It is from the Race Class Academy, launched by Professor Haney Lopez to distill the ideas of two of his books, Dog Whistle Politics, How Coded Racial Appeals Have Reinvented Racism and Wrecked the Middle Class, and Merge Left, Fusing Race and Class, Winning Elections and Saving America. Through his work, Professor Ian Haney Lopez is proposing a strategy for addressing racism by building a multiracial movement focused on economic justice. And it's going to take all of us to get there. It takes all of us to build a broader we. And I'm excited to get to hear from, I'm excited to hear about all of this from Professor Haney Lopez. But first, I have a few items to share. On your screen, there are some helpful Zoom hints to make your experience more pleasant. Also, we'd love to know who's joining us today, so I invite you to use the chat to introduce yourself to us. Let us know your name, the company or organization you're with, and where you're joining us from. It bears reminding that we are conducting this series through a virtual platform where things can be unpredictable. So we ask for your patience and grace if we stay on mute while chatting away to ourselves, if video stalls, audio crackles, if a presentation doesn't load, or if my dog Luna decides she's heard a dog whistle and wants to be part of the conversation. We'll do our best to just go with it. I want to acknowledge and thank our incredible Brave Spaces sponsors that have partnered with us to make these conversations possible. Thank you, Delta Dental and Kaiser Permanente. And you may know that it is Mile High United Way's 135th anniversary year, 135 years of being the very first United Way in the world. Thank you so much to our 135th anniversary sponsors, Excel Energy and BOK Financial. And we're honored to have Professor Ian Haney Lopez leading us in this conversation. Ian Haney Lopez teaches in the areas of race and constitutional law. one of the nation's leading thinkers on how racism has evolved since the civil rights era, his current research emphasizes the connection between racial divisions in society and growing wealth inequality in the United States. In Dog Whistle Politics, How Coded Racial Appeals Have Reinvented Racism and Wrecked the Middle Class, Professor Haney Lopez detailed the 50-year history of how politicians exploit racial pandering to fracture social solidarity and ultimately to convince many voters to support rule by the rich. After publishing Dog Whistle Politics, Professor Haney Lopez co-chaired the AFL-CIO's Advisory Council on Racial and Economic Justice, and then co-founded the Race Class Narrative Project, exploring how to defeat dog whistle politics. His most recent book, Merge Left, Fusing Race and Class, Winning Elections and Saving America, explains how the political manipulation of coded racism has evolved, while also offering an evidence-based approach to neutralizing political racism and building cross-racial solidarity. Professor Haney Lopez holds an endowed chair as the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Public Law at the University of California, Berkeley. He is also the author of White by Law, as well as Racism on Trial, books that critique the legal construction of white and Latinx racial identity. From legal scholarship to commentary, his writings have appeared across a range of sources, from the Yale Law Journal and the New York Times. He has been a visiting law professor at Yale, New York University, and Harvard, and holds a master's degree in history from Washington University, a master's in public policy from Princeton, and a law degree from Harvard. So excited that you're here, Professor Haney Lopez. So folks, as we move into the conversation, we invite you to join the discussion through the chat box. If something you hear resonates with you, please enter it in the chat box. If a phrase or a quote makes you nod your head in agreement or shake your head in disbelief, let us know through chat. And with that, we've stepped into our brave space for today's conversation. This brave space is where we get to call each other into more truth, where we have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. This brave space is where we start, where we lean into uncomfortable concepts, and from where we will grow. And we get to do all of this together. And together we'll be learning from Professor Ian Haney Lopez. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to our brave space. We are ready to learn from you.
Thank you so much, Rowena. Pardon me. I'm just absolutely delighted to be in conversation with you all. Thank you for hosting this, and thank you to everybody who's here this afternoon. Thanks for spending your late lunch hour with us. I hope this will be a fantastic conversation.
Wonderful. Okay, I want to start by level setting. When you, in your books and your podcasts or interviews that you've been on, when you talk about the left or you talk about the right, who or what are you talking about?
Sure, that's a great question. Let's start this way. We as a country are badly divided, and it's easy to think we're kind of split down the middle. But it turns out that's not the case. It turns out there's a very broad middle, about 3 in 5 people in the country who are bouncing back and forth between what we might call left and right ideas. And so it becomes very important to say, well, what are the ideas on the right? What are the ideas on the left? And why are we using these terms? I'm going to use these terms in a very specific way. And I'm going to say this sort of definition works because dog whistle politics has so structured, so refashioned electoral politics and also how we think about each other. So let me start then with dog whistle politics. So as the video suggested, dog whistle politics starts in the 1960s. Barry Goldwater starts it. He has both a racial agenda and a class agenda. His class agenda is to turn people against the New Deal at a time when most people really loved the New Deal, loved the idea of an activist government that regulated corporations, that taxed great wealth and redistributed it to the vast majority in order to create routes of upward mobility. At this point, the New Deal had created the largest expansion of the middle class the world had ever seen, the primary beneficiaries of whom were white folks. Not that African Americans and Mexican Americans in the Southwest didn't also benefit, just the way it was structured. Government activism was designed around the interests primarily of white families. And this has to do with sort of the history of the Southern Democrats. And okay, so now here's Barry Goldwater, number one agenda, convince people to unwind the New Deal, but they love it. So then he had this strategy, and this is his second agenda. Try and capture those white voters who in 1964 are increasingly agitated by civil rights and in particular by the prospect of school integration. And in order to win those votes, he developed a racial agenda of speaking in a way that reassured people they were good people, reassured them that they weren't racist, that they weren't bigots, but still to speak in a way that triggered strong racial reactions. So he talked about law and order, or he talked about, excuse me, states' rights. Both of these sound like, hey, this is about this higher principle. We should be an orderly society. Federal government should respect the sovereignty of states. But in fact, these were dog whistles, terms that were designed to speak silently on one level, to not on their surface reference race, but just underneath to trigger strong racial reactions. Goldwater loses, but Richard Nixon uses the same strategy to eke out a victory in 68 and then win in a massive landslide in 72. 1972 is this really pivotal moment when both parties come to see that these coded racial appeals, this dog whistle politics, is going to have the power to repeatedly re-elect Republican candidates with a combined agenda. Use racial divisions, and pretty soon it's going to be divisions about gender and then homosexuality. Use these sort of culture war terms to mobilize voters, but at the same time, use political power to roll back the New Deal, to return power to corporations, to cut taxes, to dismantle the social safety net. That's been our history for the last 50, 60 years, since 1972. Because dog whistle politics combined with assaults on the New Deal have become the sort of central language of American politics, that has shaped what we mean by left and right. So now to come back to the question, left and right, think about three questions. Do you feel warmly or coldly towards racial minorities? Do you believe that government provides a route of upward mobility, or instead gets in the way and the best government is the least government? Do you think that those who are economically better off have achieved that position primarily through their own effort, or because of circumstances, because of the way in which past racism continues to structure society, or because the rules are rigged? If you use those questions, and here I want to emphasize, notice the way they track the dog whistle politics conversation. Dog whistling is saying you should feel coldly towards people of color. They're undeserving, they're dangerous, they're lawbreakers, they're welfare queens. You should be hostile towards government. Government is giving power to those undeserving, dangerous minorities while it's reining in the marketplace that's the real engine of social progress. And dog whistle politics also says, if you're well off, it's because you worked hard, not because government gave you a leg up, right? In fact, government can't help you be well off all government can do is create an entitlement mentality, right? So you can see that there's a right-wing story there. There's a left-wing story. Feel warmly towards people of color, believe government has an important role to play in creating a level playing field and creating routes of upward mobility, and also believe that too often it's circumstances rather than character, rather than hard work, that determine who's well off in society. These are the two, I think, coherent, contending worldviews in the United States. And when I say coherent, I mean all three of these ideas on both sides work together to tell a story. We're a society of free enterprise, government gets in the way, and rather than promoting free enterprise, it taxes people to pay for undeserving, dangerous minorities. Or we're a society that believes in upward mobility, but right now the rules are rigged, and we think that we all need to join together, and especially to eliminate racist barriers against people of color so we can all rise together. They're two coherent, interrelated sets of ideas. How does that break out in practice? About 19% of the general population believes in all three of the ideas on the right: coldly towards people of color, hostile towards government, convinced that people are wealthy mainly because of their own effort. About 21% of the population feel warmly towards people of color, think government should serve as a route of upward mobility, and think circumstances too often explain or trap people. Now, we might think, well, okay, you know, we thought those numbers were much bigger. They're really not. There's really only about 1 in 5 people who have this sort of coherent right-wing view or this coherent left-wing view. And that leaves, again, 60% of folks who are in the middle. And I'll say this and then I'll stop. When I say in the middle, it's a myth that the middle is a considered, thoughtful, moderate place. Most people in the middle are not centrists in the way we think of somebody who's deeply considered the issue, weighed arguments on both sides, come to their own conclusion. Instead, the middle is more often and more accurately described, to use a term the political scientists use, as low information voters. These are typically folks who aren't paying a whole lot of attention. And rather than having a coherent position, they tend to flip back and forth, sometimes invoking right-wing ideas, sometimes invoking left-wing ideas. And I have in mind here one particular example I use from a focus group, where in one breath somebody says, I don't want to pay taxes so that somebody else can use food stamps to buy steaks, right? Like this idea of like, hey, your taxes are it's hard money, it's your hard-earned money taken from you to support these undeserving people. And then a couple breaths later, he says, this is America. Every child should have a chance to succeed. And if that means I need to pay more taxes to make sure every child has enough to eat and a good school to attend, then I'm willing to do that. That's the right. And he's saying both, and he believes both. That's the middle, toggling back and forth. Now you can see, and I'll just stop here, you can see immediately, the direction of our country depends on our ability to talk to that conflicted middle. Because in terms of these sort of coherent worldviews, it's 20% against 20%, roughly, 1 in 5 against 1 in 5. The question is, can we talk in a way that reaches the 60% in the middle, and in a way that helps them understand in which direction their best future lies?
I love that. So it's a lot about the stories that we tell ourselves and each other. And it feels like the dog whistling in politics is a bit of a distraction. So what are we being distracted from? Or while we're being distracted, what's really going on?
I think this is this incredibly important point. And I think it's so important on a couple levels. Look, I think a lot of us know, and certainly when I've worked with focus groups, people in the focus groups are very quick to say, we've never been this badly divided as a country in their memory. Racial tensions haven't in people's lifetimes seemed as high. The sense that you can't trust people on the other side. And it's not just partisan divisions that people are noticing. They're really noticing a lot of fear, a lot of anger, a lot of distrust. People don't like it. They want a way through. I want to be very clear. The reason we're so badly divided, the reason we as a people are so fragmented is not because there's something fundamentally wrong with Americans. It's not because we as Americans are at root fearful, hate-filled people. It's not because we as Americans are so deeply racist that 60 years after the 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, 60 years after that, we're still at each other's throat because there's something really deeply, fundamentally racist about us. I really genuinely believe that's not what's happening. What's happening instead is that dividing the American people has turned out to be a very successful way for economic royalists to recapture government. And I want to pause there to make it clear what I'm saying. If you go back to the Great Depression and then the New Deal, you had this very important moment in which both the emerging middle class and also corporate America came to understand that regulated capitalism that also supported routes of upward mobility, supported the well-being and expansion of a middle class, that was essential to the stability of our democracy and thus essential to the stability of the marketplace upon which corporations depend. In other words, you had this consensus, and probably the person who epitomizes that consensus is Dwight Eisenhower, Republican president, who nevertheless expands Social Security. There's a consensus that the marketplace, that corporations do better when all Americans do better, right? And so there's this famous line, what's good for America is good for GE, right? It's like, that was the sentiment. We tend to mock that now, but it's such an important sentiment. It's this idea that the interests of the well-off in society are aligned with the interests of the vast majority of society, aligned through the stability, the sense of linked fate associated with democracy. But at the same time that you had corporate America during the New Deal era signed on to this consensus for activist government, you always had a right-wing fringe. And these fringe folks were people like Barry Goldwater, who genuinely believed that the rich were the main engines of social progress, and that the appropriate role of government was to facilitate the accumulation of great wealth and then to protect people in their control over that great wealth, and to allow people of great wealth to in turn control and direct government and society. This is, I'm saying, a royalist view. The royal few will direct the direction of the marketplace and the country. It's a reactionary view in the sense that it seeks to take us back to that era of the robber barons, to the Gilded era. And the Depression and the New Deal, we as a society turned away from that. That interest in economic royalism never went away. And today it's represented not by corporate America, but by things like the Koch brothers and the Koch donor network. From their point of view, government is the problem. The wealthy are the main drivers of social welfare, social progress. Government should facilitate the accumulation of wealth and otherwise be under the principal direction of the most wealthy in American society. And I say this to be clear, the danger to America is not class war in the sense of corporations against workers. It's class war in the sense of a relatively few reactionary billionaires like the Koch brothers and the Koch donor network who are trying to convince the rest of us that government's the problem, that we should reduce taxes, that we should reduce regulations on corporations, that we should turn against unions, that we should see routes of social mobility not as engines of creation for the middle class, but instead as giveaways to the undeserving poor. That's what we're up against, and that's what's happening to us. So at the same time that dog whistle politics becomes the sort of principal language of American politics after 1972, that's also the peak of shared prosperity in the country, of economic equality across broad swaths of the country. And after 1980, we see this great reversal. So that increasingly more and more wealth of our country is being siphoned out of the vast middle class, the working poor included, and instead being redirected to the economic stratosphere. We are now in 2023 at levels of wealth and income inequality we last saw during the Gilded Era in the decade leading up to the Great Depression. That is, this drive by the Goldwater faction, the Goldwater faction has essentially won. And we've returned to a time when many people think government is the problem and that rescue depends upon these billionaires who have a better idea of how to direct society, right? And so that's what's been happening to all of us. And when I say it's been happening to all of us, I mean to everybody wondering why students carry so much debt, to everybody wondering why healthcare is so difficult to afford, to everybody wondering what happened to their union jobs. All of these, to their pensions, to like why have wages stagnated for families for 50 years? All of these are tied to a politics in which, rather than paying attention to how government is increasingly run for the very wealthy, too many of us are focused on the idea that government is coddling people who are undeserving or pathologically dangerous.
That's really eye-opening and a little scary. I want to go to your book, Dog Whistle Politics. It was published in 2014. And it documented years of dog whistling in politics. And from what you've seen, I'm sure there were things that you could have that I know for sure something like this is going to happen. This is the trajectory we're on. But with all that has taken place in our country since you wrote the book, was there something that you did not anticipate happening with the dog whistling?
So when I wrote the book in 2014, this is during the Obama's second administration, right? So an African-American had won the presidency twice. And I think a lot of people reacted to this thesis that race was the main language in which we were conducting electoral politics with a lot of skepticism. In fact, I remember a member of the editorial board at the Washington Post reached out and said, hey, I've seen your book. Would you write an op-ed for us? He and I worked closely to craft and polish the op-ed. And then at the last minute, he came back and said, there's a final step for editorials and it has to be approved by the editorial board as a whole. And frankly, the board as a whole doesn't believe you. The board as a whole doesn't think dog whistle politics is a major force in America anymore. They think you're talking about Nixon, they think you're talking about Reagan, but they don't see it anymore. So then 2015, and Donald Trump starts his run, and then pretty soon he wins the primaries, and he's talking about Mexico not sending its best people, Mexico sending rapists. He's talking about Muslim Americans who supposedly cheered the collapse of the World Trade Center. He's talking about closing the border and banning all Muslims. And all of a sudden, from my point of view, dog whistle politics comes back with a vengeance. But what happens? In 2016, when Donald Trump wins, people turn around and say, well, that's not dog whistle politics anymore. Indeed, that's just blatant racism. And you get editorials from the Washington Post saying things like, this is a freight train. This is a shriek of an oncoming freight train. It's the klaxon bell. No one can mistake what this message is. And they were wrong, because once I started doing focus groups, I could show, well, even if you looked at the results of the election, I could show the messages that warned about Muslims, that warned about the border, that warned about terrorists, that warned about undeserving people ripping off the system and crowding our hospitals, right? Another theme that Trump would use. Those messages were compelling to African Americans and to Latinos at the same rate they were compelling to white voters. That is, people were saying to themselves, of course we should secure the border. Of course we should protect against terrorists. Of course we shouldn't allow people to rip off our hospitals. These are just matters of common sense, not recognizing that they were still, in the language of Donald Trump, a strategy of triggering unconscious racial fears and resentments, but in a way that allowed people to reassure themselves they're good people, they're not racist, right? And so I did not see Donald Trump winning. I could see the strategy. I was zero surprised that with that strategy, he won the Republican primaries. That seemed like clearly what was going to happen, partly because Donald Trump, I think, never believed he could win the presidency, and also didn't care about the future of the Republican Party. And that combination, didn't think he could win anyway, didn't care what damage he did to the GOP, allowed him to dog whistle in a way that was far more aggressive than any other candidate. Like any other candidate who thought, I might actually advance. Jeb Bush, for example, had to think to themselves, what do I need to do to win the primary? But then how am I going to pivot to the middle? Whereas Trump is like, I'm just going to go full dog whistle, really loud, more egregious than anybody else. And with that, he connected to the base. And the other GOP candidates, the more serious candidates with respectable credentials, they couldn't compete with that because they were thinking into the future about what it would mean to run in a general election, the sort of damage that would be done to the GOP. I didn't see Trump actually winning. But the most important thing I didn't see the way in which I didn't see the coming insurrection. I did not see January 6th. Like this, the dog whistle politics that I saw in 2014 was a dog whistle politics in which politicians using culture wars, primarily racial, were engaged in dismantling the New Deal, right? So, and the subtitle to my book is like, wrecking the middle class. I could see that. I didn't see a dog whistle politics that would become so unhinged. At this point, we should just call it a strategy of racial demagoguery that would become so sort of unconstrained that it was going to put into real risk, American democracy itself. And yet I think that's where we are in 2023.
Yeah, that was something that took all of us by surprise. Dr. Haney Lopez, are you still thinking about your work in terms of a race-class narrative? This tends to focus on more of a communication strategy idea, but I've also heard you talk about paradigm shift and race-class fusion politics.
Yeah.
How are you thinking about your work now?
That's a great question. So after I wrote Dog Whistle Politics, by happenstance, the president of the AFL-CIO at the time, Richard Trumka, read the book and he said, this resonates. This seems to be what's happening within my union itself. So many union members, including especially trade union members, which have long been segregated and have made some, but relatively little progress towards becoming fully racially integrated. A lot of those trade union members, they're responding to these messages of racial resentment and ultimately voting for politicians who are targeting unions themselves. And so he said, maybe there's a way to get people to see that racism is a divide and conquer strategy. So I worked with the unions for a few years, AFL-CIO, and eventually also SEIU. And with their help, and with the help of the Open Society programs, I began running focus groups and working with political consultants, communication specialists, to craft a message that could break through, that could say, we're all in this together, no matter what we look like, how long we've been here. Some politicians are trying to divide us against each other. When we come together, we can protect our own families, whether we're white, black, or brown. That message, so there's really good news. That message turned out to be the most compelling political message on offer, whether you're comparing Democratic messages or Republican messages. It really, really resonated with people. So we called this the race class narrative, and have a bunch of examples. And this was the research, the focus groups, and the messaging that I emphasized and explained in my second book, Merge Left, which comes out in 2019. But since then, I've shifted a little bit. And the reason I've shifted is because when we're talking about linking race and class as a messaging strategy, then it tended to limit what people were hearing. People tended to hear race class narrative as, let me use this phrase, as a set of magic words. If you just did this incantation with these specific words, then everything was going to be okay. And now people who are head of communications felt comfortable with approaching this as a comm strategy. They were comfortable with comm strategies. They could see a 3 or 4 part comm strategy. They could implement it. They could run with it. But people doing canvassing, people knocking on doors, people talking to each other in the workplace, and frankly, boards of different groups and executive directors of different groups, it just seemed too complicated and too many steps. And it was like they couldn't quite get their head around what was happening. And when you can't quite get your head around what's happening, it becomes easy to default back to earlier ways of thinking and seeing the world. So now what I'm trying to convey to people is that our ability to, let me be a little bit dramatic here, our ability to save our democracy, our ability to restore the middle class, our ability to address systemic racism, our ability to address racialized policing and mass incarceration, our ability to reform our immigration system in a more humane direction, our ability to build a good, decent, just society, all of that depends on us shifting how we understand what's happened to us over the last 50 years. And in particular, shifting how we understand racism. And this is the paradigm change that I've been talking about. And also in the title of this talk, this is what I mean by fusing race and class. I don't mean replacing race with class. I do mean not solely focusing on race, not thinking about racism as principally white people hating other groups. That version of racism makes white people the problem. And if white people are the problem, this country is not advancing. We're not winning any elections. We're not saving ourselves, right? Like we're actually just strengthening the rights narrative. that the left sees white people as the problem and, is engaged in revenge or all of that garbage. Instead, we need to see that it's been in the interest of some of the most powerful actors in our society, Koch donor network, billionaires who spend more supporting candidates, political candidates, than the Republican National Party itself, right? Like some of the most powerful folks on Fox News, Rupert Murdoch, some of the most powerful people in our society are actively promoting the hatred of people of color. And when we can see, and again, notice, this is race. We're taking the deepening racism of our country very seriously. We're foregrounding it. But in order to take it seriously, we need to also look behind it. Who's funding it? Who's stoking it? Who's reinventing it? Who's profiting from it? That's this fusion of race class as a paradigm change. What's the paradigm change? To go from seeing racism as a white problem to seeing racism as a divide and conquer strategy when it convinces people to fear or hate their neighbors on the basis of skin color or immigration status or sexual orientation. To see that racism in the United States, especially in the last 50 years, has been used as a weapon of the economic royalists to turn us against each other. Once you make that paradigm change, then you're very quickly talking in the language of what we were calling the race class narrative. You're very quickly saying, there's a lot of differences. This is a heterogeneous society, but at root, we're all in this together. We all want the same things for our families. We all love the same, fear to the same, aspire to something similar. The problem we're facing is not each other. The problem we're facing is a political culture and now a social media and news culture that intentionally encourages us to fear and hate each other. And if we do that, we lose power over our government. And instead, our government is run for the interests of reactionary billionaires. But if we can come together, if we can reverse this process, if we can get to know people, especially across differences, then we can recognize our linked fate, whether we're Black or brown, Native American or Asian American or white, we're all in this equally. And recognizing our linked fate, we can work to build power with each other, to take care of our own families, and to take care of our communities and our country.
Wonderful. I love how your work continues to evolve and you're continuing to learn. But I'd love to know your story. Can you share your story, how you got to the place of wanting to understand race and class and the connection between the two?
Because I had an intellectual crisis. I realized I was wrong. So I've been studying race in a very serious way as an academic since graduate school, studying public administration, and especially in law school. And in both contexts, and really until deep into into a couple of years into the Obama administration, I was operating in that first paradigm that I'm identifying. I was operating within a paradigm that really understood racism as a white over non-white hierarchy. And now through years of study, I had a sophisticated understanding of how that hierarchy worked. We could talk about intentional bigotry, unconscious racism, implicit bias, structural racism, cultural racism, the way it worked in law. But at root, in my mind, racism was a system of whites over non-whites in which the power for that system was generated by white people, by their anxieties, their fears, their prejudices, their bigotry. So 2007, 2008, I'm studying at that point mass incarceration, which is something we build in our country starting in the 1970s. It then dramatically accelerates in the 1980s and 1990s. And now we're at a position in which the United States has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners, the vastly disproportionate share of whom are African Americans and Latinos. And I'm thinking, how do we explain racialized mass incarceration? How do we explain, and this is I'm asking this in 2008. I think a lot of you are probably asking yourselves this: how do we explain the murder of George Floyd? How do we explain these extremely high levels of police violence against Black and Brown communities, the extreme overrepresentation of African Americans and Latinos in America's prisons and jails? What's the story? And my story at the time was, a complicated version of white racism. So then Barack Obama's elected. And now Obama and I had been classmates in law school. I know him. He's no racist. And I'm thinking, and then Eric Holder's coming in as Attorney General. And I'm like, so now we're going to dismantle this system. And indeed, a colleague and I co-edited an anthology called After the War on Crime, because it was so clear to me when Obama was elected that war on crime was over. We were going to start dismantling racialized mass incarceration. And then we didn't. We didn't. The Obama administration didn't. And even worse, even more stunning, this strategy of criminalizing conduct and of building prisons and of taking a punitive approach to social problems, they started using that in the immigration context in a way that disproportionately targeted Latinos. In other words, they were deporting Latinos at far greater rates than Latinos represented in terms of the undocumented population. And so here I am by 2010 saying, I don't understand. There's no way a story of white racism, however sophisticated, explains why the Obama administration isn't dismantling racialized mass incarceration, but just the reverse, is maintaining it and expanding its technique to the immigration context. This was, I say, it was an intellectual crisis. I'm like, I've got this frame, I've got this paradigm that I've been using at that point for 20 years, a little bit more, and it's not working. So I did a lot of reading and thinking, trying to what is Obama doing? And then I realized this is American politics, not American politics as somehow outside of racism, but American politics, which had become itself a form of expressing racist ideas. Obama knew that the liberal government was always being trashed for coddling criminals, for not being sufficiently tough on crime, for turning its back on law and order. He also knew that liberal government was consistently being attacked for throwing open the border, for inviting in immigrants, for swamping the American heartland. And he knew that if he tried to unwind mass incarceration or tried to implement a humane immigration system, that he would be attacked viciously, repeatedly at the polls. And so to avoid those attacks, he solidified racialized mass incarceration. The Obama administration deported more people on a sustained basis than any other administration in the history of the country to that point. Obama wasn't being racist in a sort of this is white racism driving the policy sort of way. He was being politically savvy, but politically savvy in a way that reflected the entire shift towards racial fear and racial narratives as the core of American politics. And from there, right, I'm thinking about this in 2010, 2011, 2012. From there, the next question comes, when did this shift occur? How did this happen? And that's what takes me back to 1964, back to Barry Goldwater, And I'm looking at Barry Goldwater and I'm saying, yeah, this is a racial strategy, but more than that, it's a class strategy. And then fast forward to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan got his start as a spokesperson for Barry Goldwater. And when Reagan comes in, he comes in with the support of the Heritage Foundation. And the Heritage Foundation is backed by these reactionary billionaires. And they give him a playbook. And it's a playbook that says attack welfare, attack immigrants, attack affirmative action, and deregulate the economy, cut taxes, shift control over regulatory bodies back to corporations, and attack unions, right? Like, so by starting with the collapse of my paradigm with Obama, and then seeing what Obama was doing, but then going back and say, well, where did this come from? This pushed me towards this new paradigm, this way of seeing that the efforts by economic royalists to divide us has transformed and reinvigorated the main way racism works in our society today. The main way racism works in our society today is as a weapon of an intentional division and distraction. That's what's happening, and that's the shift. Now, just one last comment about this paradigm shift. I want to make it really, really clear. When I say a paradigm shift, I'm really emphasizing the way in which we take certain ideas for granted and don't examine them, and trying to examine them, trying to shift how we think is very difficult. What I'm not doing, and I want to be very clear about this, what I'm not doing is claiming this new paradigm of race fused to class is somehow new to me. That this is my realization. Nobody else has ever thought of this. Just the reverse. This is the older paradigm of racism. It's the paradigm of racism that people understood immediately after the Civil War, when you had a fusion movement of the white, poor, and newly emancipated African Americans who joined together to introduce 3 decades of progressive government in the South. And the reason I'm calling it race-class fusion is I want to purposefully link back to those sort of earlier American heroes who saw that racism and domination by wealthy elites were linked. Or W.B. Du Bois, who I think is one of the greatest American intellectuals we've ever had in our history, one of the phenomenal sociologists. This was his understanding of how racism and economic elites are always tightly linked. Or, and this will be a couple of final examples from the civil rights era. Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, when they were organizing farm workers in the Central Valley, understood that unions, in order to struggle effectively against employers, had to build cross-racial solidarity. And the final example, Martin Luther King, by the early to mid 1960s, sees that civil rights and an expansion of the New Deal, that reform of the marketplace and help for the poor are inseparably linked. And so when he starts to talk about a poor people's campaign, he's moving from a conception of race in which race is just this single axis, whites versus people of color, to understanding racism in the United States as inseparably connected to economic inequality that harms white people as well. And also just lastly, Reverend William Barber today in the new Poor People's Campaign. This is Reverend William Barber. And so again, to emphasize this paradigm of racism fused to class war. This is not my original idea. It's this older, more insightful, more liberating understanding of racism. We see it through the civil rights movement. We see it starting to reemerge today. And we need to lean into this shift in our own thinking.
Really powerful. Thank you. I want to go back now to your research and this continued journey that you've been on. What surprised you in the research?
Well, I kind of skipped ahead to the insurrection, and it's such a doom and gloom moment. But so let me go back to the initial research. Again, let me situate this by saying I'm a race scholar. By the time I start doing these focus groups and message testing, it's 2018. So, I've been a professor by then since 1997, right? So I'm 21 years into being a professor who specializes in racism and law. Been talking about racism my whole life. And I think I understood it. And then I walk into these focus groups. I started listening to these focus groups. And one of the first focus groups we did was of two, young in their 30s, white men in Ohio. And I'm coming in with my own sort of understanding of racism from having taught it for so many years. And I'm thinking, this is going to be bad. And it was. So no surprise, I felt confirmed. Initially, I'm listening and they're talking about how some neighborhoods are bad and it just happens to be the blacks and the browns and you're not safe and you can't go over there. And, I was standing in a store and somebody was buying a steak with welfare. And, I was like, yeah, okay, this is what I thought. And then as I kept listening, I was stunned. Because these same two guys who I was completely prepared to hear their racism also started talking about how deeply committed they were to racial equality and to fighting racism. There was one of these guys who I referenced earlier who said, every child deserves to be fed. Every child deserves a decent school. And if I have to pay more in taxes, I'll do it. And then his other, the guy he was talking to said, my son, his favorite doll is of this black girl. And he takes it everywhere. And he loves that doll. And he doesn't understand just like what that means in today's world. And I love him for it. And then the guy says, I use a picture of my son with his black doll as my personal photo on my Facebook page, right? Like there's something so deep about that he longed for this world in which we could love each other across lines of race, that's how he wanted to be known. And yet he was saying all this racist stuff. This was a huge epiphany for me. I thought that we faced a sort of a Mount Everest of racism in American society, that somehow, if we were going to convince white people to build common cause with people of color, we were going to have to surmount, we're going to have to scale, we were going to have to demolish this granite mountain of hatred that was huge and centuries in the uplift. And then I realized, no, people already in the United States, because I think of the power of the civil rights movement, because of the efforts a lot of us on this call have been making, because of the decades that have gone by with shifts in entertainment and the rise of Black and brown and Asian American actors and prominent public figures, because of the election and re-election of a Black president, most of us, almost all Americans, hold racially egalitarian values. We really do believe in the idea that we should be connected to each other without in love, in curiosity, in mutual respect, and without hatred and fear, without associated with race, without stigma associated with race. Almost all of us believe that. That's now the good news. Now the bad news, and simultaneously, almost all of us have also internalized racist stereotypes about the welfare queens and the gangbangers and the terrorists and the criminal illegals. We have these stereotypes and they're relatively easy to trigger. And so this takes me back to that 60%, that those folks in the middle who are bouncing back and forth. they're not just bouncing back and forth in terms of ideas about public policy. They're bouncing back and forth in terms of ideas about their neighbors. Are my neighbors of different colors or different immigration status or different sexual orientation? Are they pretty much like me? Do they love the same? Do they fear the same? Do they hurt the same? Can I learn from them about foods or dances or religious practices? That's one worldview, and they have that. We all have that. But we also have this other worldview. These neighbors of mine who look different, I think they're a threat to me. And I don't think I can trust them with my children. And that different sexual orientation or that transgender stuff, are my children really safe? And that religion, is it the same religion as mine, or does their religion teach hate? Right? Like these ideas, those more than anything else, are the ideas that 60% in the middle, that they're toggling between. What we're trying to do, and I don't mean to be presumptuous, but I think what a group like the United Way is trying to do is trying to show people by example, this generous view, this loving view of your neighbor. That's better for your neighbor, and it's better for you. That's what we're trying to do. And so that's the thing I'm leaning into now. That our core project, now I want to expand this. Our meaning everybody who believes in America, everybody who believes in the project of democracy, everybody who believes we are all created equal, everybody who believes e pluribus unum, out of many one. Our core project is to rebuild this generous, loving, humane view of each other, to rebuild a sense of social cohesion, of linked fate, rooted in our shared humanity. Because for 50 years, that sense that we're in this together has been intentionally trashed. So we got to repair. We have to repair. We have to repair the we. And I think the way to do that is to understand this linking, this purposeful linking of race and class to divide us and distract us. And so now we have to link race and class to rebuild our connection to each other.
Just going to sit with that for a second. That was really powerful. I'm sensing some hope in your words, and that makes me feel good, because in the process of building a broader we, does seem daunting. And throughout the reading of your book, I experienced moments of hope and moments of, I have no idea how we're going to get to a shared prosperity. I'm from South Africa, and we have a philosophy of Ubuntu, of seeing yourself in others, of building empathy, which sounds incredible. I am who I am because of who you are. But that can be extremely difficult to do when you realize you have to see yourself in someone with whom you're not on the same page. So
I think that's right. I think that's right. So I don't know what the future holds for the United States. And I say that in a way that shocks even myself. I wouldn't have said this in 2019, let alone in 2014. Lately, on several occasions, I've been asked to speak with scholars of democratic collapse. And it's a sobering experience, because people are saying, what do you think the prospects are for civil war, understood as, widespread political violence in the United States? And the answers I'm hearing from my panelists are somewhat greater than 50%, more likely than not. And then the conversation is turning to me, and they're saying, one of the key drivers of societies collapsing into civil war is a formerly dominant group typically organized along racial, ethnic, or religious grounds, who feels that they are now an embattled minority and turn to violence to restore their perceived their previous dominant position. Can you connect that to what's happened to dog whistle politics, right? Like, that's the question I get. And I'm like, the story that dog whistle politics is telling, the basic right-wing story is, well, the basic story of Make America Great Again is this, or even more powerfully, even more dangerously on Fox News, great replacement theory. That's a story of a previously esteemed and dominant group being reduced to an inferior minority status and being encouraged to believe that they need to resort to violence to protect themselves from this suppression, from this oppression that they feel is already looming, right? And I think that that's the story of so many of the insurrectionists. The number one demographic predictor of people who participated in the insurrection was not coming from a right-wing voting county. It was not watching Fox News. It was coming from a county that had experienced a significant loss in white population, significant decline in white population over the previous decade. The number 3 state in terms of sending people to the insurrection was California, right? We're in the midst of this incredibly dangerous moment where people are being told and are coming to believe that they represent a formerly esteemed group that is now being subject to replacement, humiliation, degradation, that faces the prospect of violence from pathologically criminal gangsters or terrorists, what have you. If we don't stop this, it is more likely than not that we will move to widespread, ideologically, politically racist mass violence in the United States, more likely than not. And I never thought as a scholar of race that racism would get so bad that in my lifetime, I could see the country sundered. But in this moment, I think there really is this sort of sense of like, there is a way forward. And it's a way forward that is directly responsive to and commensurate with the scale of the threat we face. I genuinely believe through my research that the vast majority of Americans want to be connected to their fellow citizens, want to have a sense of linked fate, want to engage with each other with a sense of shared respect and dignity and mutual curiosity. That's the vast majority of us. And the hope comes in realizing that we can unleash that power, that we can encourage that we can say to people in a way that people understand and that in a way that resonates with people, joining together across difference is the pragmatic route to your family's salvation. And here I want to come back, Rowena, to this concept of Ubuntu. It's a beautiful concept, and it's a necessary concept, and it's a liberatory concept, and it could do that work in the United States. But I want to sharpen an important point here. Very often, those of us who stress our human connections do so through moral language or ethical language or spiritual language or religious language. In other words, we tell people the right thing to do, the good thing to do. is to recognize our shared humanity, that Ubuntu is the value that we should hold. Okay, but here's the reality. People are simultaneously being told your husband could get blown up by a terrorist. Your children aren't safe at school. You can't afford to live in that city or even travel there. In other words, the part of their mind, the unconscious mind that is fearful of danger is constantly being triggered by racial demagoguery, by culture war politics. And if you say to people who are in the grips of an adrenaline rush, telling them they have to decide between fighting or fleeing, to listen to their higher selves, they're not going to listen to their higher selves. They're just not. They're going to say something like what I heard in focus groups: that'd be great. I got to worry about my kids. And so the shift we're making here, this paradigm shift, we're shifting away from saying, hey, racism is this great moral evil, you should be your higher self, to saying, hey, racism is the number one threat in all of our lives, whether you're Black or brown, Asian American, Native American, or white. And I'm going to say this last part again. The number one threat in the lives of white families in the United States is racism against Black and brown people. It's the number one threat because it's what's convincing so many people to fear and hate their neighbors, and instead to turn government and our economy over to rapacious billionaires who are rigging the system, who are busting unions, who are stripping corporations of funds to cover their pensions, who are destroying our environment, who are impeding progress towards slowing down global climate change. Like, all of that's happening to white families today, and not just that. It's this sort of lie that threatens to destabilize our democracy and push us into mass political violence. All of that's happening because of the weaponization of anti-Black and anti-brown racism. In other words, I want us to all talk the language of Ubuntu. I want us to all talk in the language of linked fate, or to recover language from the civil rights movement. I want us to embrace and preach integration, partly because it's the right thing to do, it's morally just, but principally because it's the only practical way we save our families. It's the only pragmatic way we reverse the harms being done, we address and defeat the strategy that's being used against us, and we restore our confidence in the project of democracy, a democracy that, when it works, really does lift up all of us, right? Like, and again, I want to just to sharpen this. Ubuntu is the way forward. Integration is the way forward as a moral matter and as a practical matter. And as a practical matter, we have no other choice but to embrace Ubuntu, to embrace integration, or to stand by as our society collapses into mass violence. I genuinely believe that.
Yes, I am on board. I am committed to the path forward that you've laid out for us. Thank you so much, Professor Haney Lopez. You have been our courageous truth teller today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rowena, and thank you all.
Of course. And to our audience, thank you so much for being here. We know sometimes listening can be an act of courage, so thank you for being courageous too. Thanks again to our Brave Spaces sponsors, Kaiser Permanente and Delta Dental. We invite you to seek out more of our upcoming Brave Spaces conversations this year. We're excited to be talking to Dr. Lisa Roy, the first executive director of Colorado's Department of Early Childhood, next week. And we're really looking forward to being joined by Anand Girtidas, columnist and author of Winners Take All and The Persuaders, next month. Please join us as we learn together and, more importantly, act together. Until next time, take good care, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thanks so much.